Good afternoon, and welcome to the closing discussion of today's program, Libraries Are Essential. I'm Sari Feldman, and I want to thank you all for attending and participating in the program. As a reminder, our talk will be followed by a special closing keynote from U.S. Representative Jamie Raskin, and you certainly will want to stick around for that. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what the future will require of library leaders. Certainly, much has changed in the last 2 years. We are enduring a tragic global pandemic that has claimed over 1 million lives in the US alone so far, and has raised significant ongoing challenges for public health and worker safety. Following the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago this week, a racial justice movement has called us all to address systematic racism in our society, including in our libraries and schools. And the pace of technology continues to accelerate, creating new challenges for libraries, from issues of cost, sustainability, and equity of access, to questions about free speech, censorship, and the rise of misinformation. What does this all mean for library leaders? Early into the pandemic, many library leaders acknowledged that we couldn't just reopen the library doors after the pandemic shutdowns and carry on as usual. To close today's program, we wanted to talk a little bit about what values and practices library leaders can lean on and carry forward, and what must we do differently. There are no easy answers today, of course, but we do hope to better define some of the pressing questions library leaders are facing now and into the future. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Please welcome Stephanie Chase. Stephanie is Executive Director of Libraries of Eastern Oregon, where she leads the work of a 15-county, 50-library consortium that supports the libraries of Eastern Oregon with resource sharing, training, and networking opportunities. Welcome, Stephanie. R. David Lankes is an award-winning author, educator, and a passionate advocate for the essential role of libraries. David is the Virginia and Charles Bowden Professor of Librarianship at the University of Texas at Austin School of Information. Welcome, David. And Roosevelt Weeks is a veteran library leader who's been showing his leadership skills continuously since he arrived to be the current director of Austin Public Library in Texas. Welcome, Roosevelt.
It's good to be here.
Stephanie, let's start by tackling something very concrete, library buildings. A year ago, people were just starting to head back into library buildings with a host of restrictions. Many libraries today are pretty much back to pre-pandemic operations. But how does it feel to be back in those library buildings? And do you have a sense of who's coming back and maybe who isn't? And is it too early to start thinking about how the use of buildings may be impacted long-term? So just jump right in.
Well, thank you, Sari. So I'll be interested in what Roosevelt in particular has to say, because I'm certainly bringing the perspective from our rural library colleagues. And while I certainly will not pretend that I'm representing rural libraries in totality, for me, the libraries in the eastern part of our state have basically been open full service since May 2020. When the Oregon governor, allowed library spaces to be back open. And for many of our rural counterparts, they've been welcoming people back into spaces for more than 2 years, almost 2 years. And I think there's a level of engagement in our rural library spaces. They tend to be smaller. We tend to know each other more. Our staff and our public tend to know each other really well. That I think has allowed a lot of the transition back into spaces in our rural libraries to be a little bit smoother. It's a little bit different to be fighting with somebody about restrictions when you know them and you see them, at the grocery store or at school or when you're out on a walk. Then sometimes, certainly than my experience working in urban libraries, when sometimes or busy libraries, when you have a volume of people coming in that make it hard to have those continuous connections. So for me, when I think about what I hear from our libraries on the eastern side of the state, they have been back to normal for a long time. They've been back up to pre-pandemic levels, if not more, now of visits, and are seeing very much the same people coming back in, that there has not been a drop. People missed their libraries and were eager to get back into using them in the way that they had been using them before as part of a small community. So I'd be really interested in hearing, Roosevelt, what that experience has been like for you in Austin.
And Roosevelt, if I'm remembering correctly, the Austin Public Library had opened not long before the pandemic. So we especially want to hear about that.
It's great to be here. And, we have been in a tough situation here with the governor, not mandating masks in buildings and all of those type things. And it was difficult for us to actually work in that environment, but we managed to do so. We're glad to be open. Again, we just recently opened fully to the public back in March with some restriction. We've allowed our customers to come into the buildings without mask in April. And so we just recently done that. And primarily because the pandemic is still real. It's still here and alive. And we wanted to make sure that, our staff and our customers were safe from the virus. And so we waited to after the spring festivals to end before we allowed folks to come into our building without masks. Prior to that, we allowed them to wear masks. But it is great to be back in the building because we are a public library and interacting with people is what we do. One of the things several things we've done to make sure that we can instill the safety of our staff and our customers walking into the door. We installed a ionization system within our HVAC system to make sure that any germs that come in, they're being addressed when they come into the building. We still have our plexiglass up. Staff still want to have them up. We did a poll recently asking who want to take them down versus who wanted to keep them up, and it was 50-50 primarily. And so we decided to keep that up because people want to feel safe. All of our staff and customers were offered PPEs throughout this pandemic, and still to this day, we're still doing that. Hand sanitation, sanitizers are still available to anybody that want to use them. So it's wonderful to be back in the space. We're starting to open programming again indoors. But some of the things that we're going to continue to do because of the pandemic and the way people not feeling comfortable coming back into our libraries. And so we want to make sure that we can provide those options to them, whichever way they want to go, whether they want to come into our buildings or not. Prior to the pandemic, in our central library, we were averaging about 100,000 people a month coming into our buildings. Now we're back to about 40,000 a month, and that number is rising. It is great to be in a town where people love libraries. We have students from 3 of the major campuses that's right near our building that comes in. And so we are a vibrant location, and people are beginning to starting to slowly trickle back into our spaces. And so we're very happy about that.
David, unless you have something burning you want to add to that, I'd love to jump to the next question with you because I think it really relates to what Roosevelt was saying about the people who work in his library. In an earlier discussion today, we heard from library workers about the stress they are experiencing during the pandemic. David, you've written and talked a lot about finding a new normal in libraries and about what you've called radical empathy. Library leaders need to have that for their workers. So can you talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the new normal and what we've learned about library work over the last 2 years?
Yeah, it's. I believe the piece where I wrote that was very much in the middle of the pandemic, so about a year in. I think what we found is that a lot of librarians, library workers were reacting differently to some of the language and narratives that we used around the profession, the notion of it being a vocation, the notion of libraries sort of out to serve and save the world, the idea of sort of rallying cries about, it's all for the community and we can take it on. These were terms that we used a lot, particularly when were libraries necessary and what was it looked like the last economic downturn, et cetera. And yet in the pandemic, what was happening is they weren't becoming rallying cries. We really saw frontline workers use them as a way of demonstrating that they felt a lot of folks were out of touch. And we saw, and for me, I've been looking at libraries for a quarter century now. God, I'm old. It was the first time that I saw a really strong divide in discussions online, in different forums and such, that really put a divide between library administration and the frontline worker. Now, it wasn't universal and it wasn't across the way, but it was really strong. And I think it took some of us by surprise, because the idea is like, wait, aren't we all doing this together? And the answer is, you're not sitting here worried about what's going in front of that PPE. You're not sitting here talking about how I have to deliver to cars and such, and that could be my life. That really put a strong dialogue, I think, around the idea of how we administer and manage our buildings, how we listen to folks. We've seen it in a rise in leadership positions, even among ALA, looking at the importance of worker concerns and worker separation. And I think that's all for the positive. I think that when you look at libraries that really thrived during the pandemic, and I mean that in the way of no one was happy to have it, but really rallied to provide support, support their community, and to support themselves around well-being. I think about, I'll leave Roosevelt to brag about himself, but clearly evidence of that kind of leadership. But I think about the University of Toronto. When the University of Toronto realized that the pandemic was actually really crippling food pantries and food distribution to the poor around the city, because the majority of people who volunteer and work in food pantries and food delivery services, social services, were elderly, and they just could not be out in public. Vickery Bowles and the administration of the Toronto Public Library asked the librarians to volunteer to staff and provide that service. And not only did they do that, but they quickly realized that the service wasn't run terribly efficiently before, so they took over and created a whole new logistical effort. And they still have winterized shipping containers in some library branches to keep delivering food at this time as a way of reconnecting to communities, reconnecting to literacy. But it was the administration asking, and it was the administration standing shoulder to shoulder in those food pantries that made the difference. And so that's one thing. The other thing that I was really surprised by is, as you say, I've been writing around this new normal, and we had a symposium where we gathered library leaders and thinkers, and we said, all right, so what's the new normal agenda? And the outcome of that really surprised me, which is we didn't come up with one. And when we were sort of thinking about why, one of the library workers said, we're tired, we are under stress, we are at a point where we just can't think about what's next yet. We need to do a lot of healing within the profession. And hearing that and understanding that became a really clear demonstration that while a lot of us seek to once again think about where we can be and think about our communities and put them forward, the radical empathy is not with the person that's outside. I think we all have that. But the person inside the building, the person who's got to make that happen, the person who's struggling with someone who may be immune compromised at home, the person who may be the primary breadwinner, the person who may be alone, and if they get sick, that's a problem. That's what I think really is one of the silver linings, particularly if we use that and move forward, looking forward about how we provide this radical empathy to our own library workers in our own settings, to the students, to the interns. And we really look at this and say, how can we be a community unto ourselves that takes care of ourselves, and then we can take care of those that we serve.
I mean, that's kind of a beautiful way of thinking about the relationships we have at work. And I don't know if Roosevelt or Stephanie would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that pandemic, it has done a lot to a lot of us mentally. Not only the staff, but the people that come to us who had to be in isolation for a long period of time. Those things long term will have some impact on us and how we do our work. some of the things that we've tried to do here, since we are a public library, we can't have our majority of our staff working from home. Some have advocated that they do that, but I found that it would be very difficult to do your job from home. And so what we've tried to do is, keep with our virtual programming, not having staff on the desk, the full time, give them a break in the back office to doing some back office work. Those are type things that we're looking to do to make sure that staff doesn't get burnt out, that they feel that, that they are valued in a way that is meaningful for them and not just from the administration standpoint. It is very important that we keep our staff safe because, as David mentioned, there are folks at home that may be immune compromised that we don't want to impact them and their families. But one of the things I'm very proud of, with the measures that we put in place, based on what HR is reporting out, that no one in our system contracted the virus while in our building. We did have some staff member to get the virus, but it was outside of, on their own time and in their outside work or day-to-day lives. But, we're very proud of that fact. And we're going to continue to work with our staff to make sure that we communicate changes as best we can. Because one of the things that this new normal that we're trying to come up with is you got to be flexible. Things are changing on a regular basis. We hear the pandemic is rearing its ugly head again in the Northeast. And so those are type things we got to continue to be prepared for and to continue to prepare our staff for these changes that come about. And that has a mental impact on our staff as well. And so what we try to do is to communicate as best we can so that they are aware of what these changes are, what we're doing to make sure that they can prepare their lives and make sure it has minimal impact on their family lives as well.
If I could just jump in really quickly to tell you the way I met Roosevelt, which is we had an appointment for 10 a.m., which is when the library opened, and I walked in off not the main entrance, and I went up to the desk and I said, I have a 10 o'clock appointment with the director. Could you send me to his office? And they said, actually, he's right there. And Roosevelt was standing at the main entrance as people were coming in, and he was welcoming them, and he was handing them masks. And as he showed me around, every one of the staff members, and he asked, oh, thank you for this, and oh, I see you're working on this and such. It was a symbol, but it was a meaningful symbol. That when we talked about the idea of, the administration taking on the same tasks and the same risks and being part of it.
Great.
So I think, I just want to, I think like the thing I often say is we've been working this way in rural libraries for a long time. And I think we often don't give credit to our rural library workers who have been working this way. Again, this is the way it is. How do we support each other, right? How do we share the burden? What does that look like when everybody has a stake in taking care of our staff as a whole, right? That those divisions are much more difficult to maintain when you're in a smaller setting. And our rural library colleagues, I think there's a lot that we can learn from about how to be, good colleagues to each other. And I think, David, what you said too about, really thinking about that future piece, for me, one of the things that has always resonated with me about public library service is that it's really hard to have a consistent picture of what the future is because our service is really community oriented, right? What works for my community might not work for yours, might not work for Roosevelt's, it might not work for Sari's. So, that it's hard. We often get trapped, right, in kind of this, our profession moving towards something, one direction. And we need to take a moment to step back and think, is this really what my community, right? What this community that I'm in is asking me for? Am I listening to what the people I serve are really asking me for?
Stephanie, I just want to let you know that I was jealous. And you guys here in Texas, they started doing inside programming probably 6 months to 7 months after the pandemic started. And I was just jealous because the community around there was saying, hey, X is doing this. Why can't we do that? And so, yeah, I'm jealous of you guys and the work you guys do because, it is different. We have a different clientele and they have different needs. And so I'm very proud of the work that you guys do.
Thank you.
Well, Stephanie, back to you. It's not all bad news and challenges, of course, and you are all telling some good news here today. There are opportunities for libraries as well. And I think we would agree that libraries and librarians rose to the challenge and showed their value during the pandemic. And one of the things that's been really exciting for me is that statistics suggest reading has ticked up sharply over the last 2 years. Any thoughts on how libraries hold on to that trend and continue to nurture a reading renaissance?
So no, you and I are big Readers Advisory fans, and I think one of the things that's really important for us to remember, and I have always tried to remember in libraries, is that people really think about books first when they think about libraries. It's not the only thing they think about, and it's not the only thing we do, but there's really this opportunity to lean in to what comes to mind first for people. And I think to really own the space that we're in, it is difficult for people to get personalized recommendations from another reader about what to read. And I think the more that we can really support that we can really support the work that our library staff are doing about creating those personal connections with readers, sometimes person to person, sometimes it's happening, via email or it's virtual. I think it's really important to remember that people love that for us. And that I think all of us probably here in this session are readers. And if we close our eyes and we think about how special it is to get a recommendation from somebody that we care about or someone that we think really knows us, how quickly that book moves to the top of our pile. Or, for me, I'm not an audiobook listener, but I have a good friend who is. And when she recommends one to me, I listen to it because I know it's going to be good. So I think it's really important just to remember that this is something people want from us. And how can we create that space for people to have conversations together? Often around books. If we start with books, there's a great way to really expand that, beyond what else we might be offering that they would be interested in. But always up for a good book recommendation.
Anything anybody would like to add? Or
I think that's part of my problem is when I get recommendations. I'm in the middle of a book. I get a recommendation. I'm reading this. I'm reading 3 and 4 books at one time because of those recommendations. So it's a wonderful thing.
I think just really quickly, we're also seeing a changing narrative, particularly in public libraries. A lot of summer reading programs, huge thing to try and get kids reading. It's almost all written around reading retention, the idea that there's a summer slide. And the data that actually led to that is not that concrete. And actually, we're beginning to see a shift in language, the idea of early literacy, the idea that libraries can be fundamental in not only helping parents become more literate, but therefore instilling and supporting their children as readers and getting ready for school. What we know in basic literacy is that if kids aren't reading at reading level 3rd grade, their odds of completing high school go way down. And we know that in many populations, once they don't get a high school degree, the odds of things like incarceration go way up. Literacy is fundamental to our economy. It's fundamental to our education. It's fundamental to our democracy. And I think that what we're seeing, our libraries really take this positive attitude to it, as opposed to, chocolate covered broccoli about, please read and we'll give you an iPad at the end of the summer, is starting to take hold.
And David, that's why it's so important that kids see themselves in the materials that's available to them. Without that, it's a struggle. Everybody want to see a hero in the book. They want to see themselves in that book. And that is how we get kids to start reading and enjoying reading and not being bribed to read, but enjoying the process.
Well, Roosevelt, let's lean into that a little bit more. During the pandemic, school-age children struggled to maintain grade-level benchmarks while learning in the remote environment. And schools have now reopened, but families certainly need support to regain achievements, particularly in reading and in math as well. So what's the role that libraries are going to play to help children, but also the entire family?
With budget constraints being in place, it's important that schools, public libraries partner together to help in this effort. It cannot be done by one entity. It has to be a collaborative effort to make sure that the most vulnerable of the population in schools, that we're there to help them. And so what we try to do here in Austin is every kid that's enrolled into a public school in Travis County get a free library card. Only thing they have to do is to to the parents or guardian to sign a release form to say they got the car. That's all they have to do. We get the data from the school district. They can opt out to not get the card, but every kid get a library card. That's one of the ways. We have to make sure that the materials that's available is available to them when they're out of school. That in-school learning is important, but the time that they're out of school is so much important. That's why it's so important that we have our doors open when kids get out of school. They're flocking to our libraries and they're looking for something while their parents, for a lot of kids, their parents are working those after-hour jobs. And so we are there to help them. And so what we have to do to work with school district is to talk about lesson plan. What are they learning in school? And we can add on to that when they come to see us. And that's the crucial part, is that it's a continuous process. And oftentimes when they come to us, we can make it where it's not in a learning environment, so to speak, that it's in a playful environment, yet and still they're learning what they learned in school, but in a different format.
Well, that, we know that libraries are essential for supporting education. And libraries were also there with the digital content during this long period of remote learning. And a lot of libraries formed that partnership with schools so that the public library collections were available to the schools as well. Stephanie, now that the buildings are reopened, are we still seeing, the strong use of digital content? And how are libraries balancing those budgets between physical and digital content? And do you see the ebook lending easing at any time now that the physical collection is open? And I also would love to hear from you and Roosevelt and David. Is there anything you would say to publishers to encourage more reasonable pricing and access terms for digital content?
Well, certainly the thing that I would say is that the members of our public don't understand the lending models that we have. And the one copy, one model, digital, physical, treating our digital copies like our physical copies, it continues. However, I think I've been involved in this for 15 years, continues to be a huge challenge to just explain to people. For us, I think out on the eastern side of the state, we definitely saw an increase in digital use, and that increase has stayed high. And the burden of meeting the holds demand for that remains a huge challenge. So here in the state, aside from a handful of our very largest libraries, the libraries are part of a consortium for ebook access, and the holds queues are significant and they're long. And again, it's a challenge, a continuous challenge to explain to people, our patrons, why they're waiting. So for me, I think, again, across the 15 years that I have been in this space, both in very urban libraries and in some very, very rural libraries, I haven't seen that interest or that level of use decline. I've seen it just become more interesting, and people having more interest. And I think over the past 2 years, we have had this ability to really train people about how to use these resources. So again, overcoming one of those other barriers that was just about how to access it and how to use it, people have had a lot of practice. So I think publishers really need to remember that we are not the enemy here. And I'm sure David can bring this up too. There's a lot of research about how readers interact in a reading ecosystem, and that libraries do promote book purchasing, and that we need to remember too that libraries are a big purchaser ourselves, helping to really contribute to the market. So we're here to help publishers really get visibility for their materials. We're here to be champions for those collections. We're here to connect readers and learners with what publishers are putting out. And I think it would be really wonderful to be seen as a partner in that, which I wouldn't say that I necessarily see.
And Stephanie, you hit the nail on the head there. Many studies have shown that public libraries increase the sales of books globally, and the publishers are in the business of making money. That's no doubt about that. But I think they're they are standing on our backs in order to do that. If we got the same pricing as others got, it'll be much better. But I keep saying to myself and some colleagues around the country is that we need to band together, because if you put all the public libraries together, you're probably talking about $1 billion in spending. We need to join forces and say, hey, until they do this, let's just slow down our buying power. Let's just slow the buying down and see what that impact is, because it's going to continue unless we make a stand that, hey, we can't keep taking this, paying 40 and 3 times the amount that others will get. That's not reasonable, and it's not sustainable long term for us or for our customers. And so I think, as Stephanie stated, it has to be a partnership where it's a win-win. And I think right now the only side that's winning is the publishers right now. And our customers are really, really struggling when we can't get these things in a timely manner, and also get as many copies as we definitely need. This is going to continue to go up because we got people that it's always on the go. Myself, give me a print copy any day of the week. But when I'm traveling, I use the virtual book. So we do need to find that happy medium so that libraries are not suffering where our customers are suffering as well.
I think we also need to look at other ways in which we can partner with the publishing industry, which is, quite frankly, ebooks are horrible. I mean, if you look at how long it took us to invent things like title pages and page numbers when Gutenberg figured out the press, that was a couple centuries. We're now, 30, 40 years into at least experiments with ebooks, and we're really to the point of making it really feel like paper as opposed to what else it could be. One of the things that we saw in the switch to digital was not only the idea of digital reading material, but we saw library programming go up dramatically. We saw that, we're used to get 10 and 15 people coming to a program. We had 200 and 300 people in a program. When we used to be able to provide books and materials on different things, we now had librarians were creating videos around Tai Chi and Dungeons and Dragons and creating these focus groups. For a long way to say that I think what's interesting is, while the pandemic started with a reliance on digital material distribution, which is sort of an old core library land, it really evolved to digital content creation and augmentation. And I just long for the day when we can look at an ebook reader and dream bigger than we can add annotations here, and we can make it basically a long string of text broken into screens, and we can look at all the great authors that are in rural Oregon. In fact, a lot of authors move to rural Oregon so they can be there and be creative and come up with them. Writing groups, distribution. I taught a class at Austin Public Library, and it was in their gallery space. That idea that we can show off content creation. Just imagine the idea of libraries and publishers working together to reinvent the idea of what books can be in a community setting. That, to me, gets really exciting. And it begins with, and I don't want to lose the point that was just brought up, it begins with a reasonable business relationship. But then I think, just think about the possibilities of where we can go from here.
Yeah.
So, Stephanie, diversity, equity, and inclusion are core values of library work. But in the wake of the George Floyd murder, library leaders around the country recognized that we simply hadn't done enough to address the EDI issues in library collections, or really in terms of our staff and our operations. Over the last 2 years, recruiting and retaining diverse staff and creating more diverse collections has been an important focus. So talk a little about where you see libraries today in terms of EDI issues. And I'm sure our audience would appreciate hearing your reflections on EDI efforts underway in public libraries. And while cultural competency is critical to the future of the profession. And of course, we want everybody to weigh in on this. So Stephanie, you want to start?
So for me, one of the programs that we're doing is we established a group of geographically based equity learning cohorts for people, because I think we need to recognize the learning that needs to happen at a system level for us, that libraries, we need to recognize as library workers, and the sun came out here in Oregon. It's very strange right now. I'm trying to get myself not in the sun. So we need to recognize, I think, the oppressive systems that a lot of our service and our models are based on. and that we really need to do some work. We need to do the work to uncover them. And we need to be listening to the people in our profession who have, if we're being honest, for a long time told us the changes that we need to make. If we are to be reflections of our communities, if we are to be reflections of our global community, we need to have a diversity of voices, a diversity of experiences, and a diversity of backgrounds that are really in these community-based spaces that we're talking about. And I think for those of us that those of us who need to do the work, those of us who make up the majority of this profession, white women, need to recognize the learning that we have to undertake. We have to be willing to adapt a growth mindset, be vulnerable, and learn about what needs to be changed and then make those changes. And to really not put that burden on our staff of color and our colleagues of color.
David?
You know, I've learned a lot in my time in South Carolina, and I have a fabulous colleague, Nicole Cook, who I believe is also on the program here, who taught me a lot and really guided me through a lot of this thinking, and I want to thank her for that. But it comes down to, I think we have two structural issues we need to, many, but one, we need to worry about sort of professional library science education, making it more accessible at the graduate degree in terms of not only getting online, but cheaper, and really build up communities and mentorship networks where we can demonstrate it. It turns out the University of Texas is a historically Hispanic serving university, and it does matter that you build up a cohort and you have folks and peers across the institutions you can speak to. But the other one is, and particularly to my colleagues in rural libraries, we need to look at the cracks around the MLIS. We need to look at the people who are becoming librarians by spirit, by job, by whatever, and building learning networks and building networks where if you're the only person in a county serving 1,500 people, you can connect to people in Houston and Denmark and whatever, and really begin to build a collegial base that looks like you, values and thinks like you. And I think that's been extraordinarily powerful. When I look at, for example, the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, how they have not simply talked about the profession, but talked about their life within the profession, talked about supporting each other, talking about showing up, and how can we acknowledge that power and acknowledge that expertise and get out of the way in many ways.
And Roosevelt.
Sarah, I truly believe that we are in one of the greatest professions, period. We do have a lot of challenges that we have in our profession, but I think we're making some strides to get there. We're not there yet. We just have to do a lot of work and acknowledge that we do have a problem, because what we're seeing, throughout our country and throughout the world, for that matter, is the library is a macrocosm of what's going on outside, and so we have people in our system, on both sides of the spectrum when it comes to, life and issues that's surrounding us. And so we have to make sure that we're including everybody in this conversation and not, talking at each other, making threats against one another, but bringing people together to talk about, the issues that we're facing. And I'm talking about library workers now. One of the things that we're doing here in Austin is, looking at 4 different areas when it comes to the EDI work. When I first got here, one of my first goals was put EDI as one of our priorities. And what we wanted to look at was the hiring. We had, the representation of African-American and Hispanic in our organization. It was about 40% of us in the organization, but where they were in the organization is what matters. And most of those folks are the lower level, the custodial security officers. That's where they were. There was no one of color on the executive team. And so we had to look at our hiring practices to make sure that our panels are equitable across the board, where they're diverse in every aspect. Then we looked at our collection development. We have about 40% Hispanic population here in the city. Only 7% of our collection were Spanish speaking or addressed Spanish individuals. And so we have to make those changes. The other issues is looking at our services and our programming, making sure that our cultural programming is on point for those neighborhoods, those communities, address their needs. And then finally, we start looking at our policies, because a lot of our policies, they were intentional, they were intentional, but they had some issues that excluded people from them. And so we're looking at all of those things to make sure that we can address everybody that walk in our building. What I tell my staff is, we say that library for all, we have to mean that. And that's everybody that walks through that door, they get the same treatment, no matter who's addressing them, who's there with them, or who's out, what they bring with them. We're there to address all of their needs. Not all their needs, but address their concerns or when they walk in for us. And one of the things I'm so happy about is that we're partnering with UT, the iSchool, and David and his class he has allowed me to just talk directly to them, to let them know what the expectations are for public libraries. We're the most public of public institution, where we don't ask for any ID. You don't have to have a reason to be here. You just walk in, and making sure that people are prepared to come to this profession and to serve everybody, regardless of what they look like, how they're dressed, no matter who they are, we're able to serve them. And I think we're making strides to get there. It's a topic that's in libraries that we're trying to address. And I just hope that we continue to work with one another to make sure that we can cross this line where we can serve everybody that walking in the door.
Well, that's a good reminder to us, and a good tie-in to what might be the last question for this program, since we're drawing to a close. And I wanted to make sure that we did get the view from library school, as I still think of it, library school, in an age when book banning and misinformation is on the rise. What is the future of librarianship? What does it look like? And are enrollments in library programs stable or up and down? And this is near and dear to my heart. It seems to me that the bedrock values and skills that come with that MLIS are more important than ever. So, David, what are you seeing in your work?
We're seeing a really strong population. We're seeing growing numbers. We're seeing stronger programs. So that is, the stuff that people don't necessarily pay attention to, but matter. For example, that library science programs are still strong and in strong academic institutions, that they are in leading academic institutions, that they are in leading roles in those. And so we see a lot of students, the expansion to not only talking about the core skills, but as you say, the core values of librarianship, and very much increasing the technology aspects. But the real trend that's going on in library science education, the trailing, that is where we're trying to catch up, is around community engagement. That we don't longer look at it and say, here's cataloging, here's information seeking, these are the hard skills, and then soft skills are nice, we don't know how to deal with that. We now start with the idea of, how do you work with your community? How do you identify needs and aspirations of the community? How do you identify, and then how do you facilitate conversations within it? How do you gather that data, and then how does that transform into programs? And then how do you assess the programs? I mean, that sounds somewhat boring, but it really is this swing that we're seeing from the library as an institution that does things to the library as a facilitator and convener of communities, be those communities in K-12, be those communities in academic institutions, in locations, municipalities, or in businesses and law firms. So what we're seeing is also a pretty steep decline in the incoming age of our folks. And so you're seeing that the average age of people starting library science programs has moved over the past 20 years from the early 40s, mid 30s, down to people coming increasingly right from undergraduate programs. They're coming in with an increasing set of skills and a more diverse set of skills. We're not just getting history majors and English majors, we're getting physics majors and computing majors and biology majors who want to put their efforts to improvement and social good. And I think those are all positive trends. So we're seeing, I think, a really strong population of students coming in. We're also seeing a shift in, I'm at the University of Texas. I'm now one of 2 programs that remain as in-person programs. I was in Chapel Hill. Now the majority are online, either partially or wholly online. And that means we have the ability to reach greater communities and greater diversity, as long as we sort of put our commitment and values and money where it matters to do that. So the good news is things are good. I will tell you, having had a class on community engagement, the #1 topic among library science students was banned and challenged materials. That's not just because it's Texas. As we've talked to folks across the country, this is a major concern. These are students, the things students used to be really worried about were, how do I pick which book to buy, and what happens if someone asks me a question I don't know? We were laughing that when we used to teach reference classes, the hard reference class was, what if someone asked how to build a bomb? And it's hilarious because now it's what happens when someone brings in their phone shooting video, declares that they're in a First Amendment audit of our institution. Go through and film what people are doing on their computers and reading, and then sit and have shouting matches with librarians. This is a different world. I was talking with a great library director, and I was sort of saying, well, what can I do in this banned environment as an academic? He says, please don't stand up and give a lovely speech. She goes, that's great, but what we really need is for you to go fight so that we pay librarians what they're worth. That we need to pay frontline workers that are, in essence, in terms of bringing our communities together to being, as Roosevelt said, the most public of public institutions, that they are supported, paid what they're worth, and that we understand the traumatic portions of their job and support them in doing that. So if you want to help libraries around banned books, support librarians in doing that.
That's a nice last word from you, David. Stephanie, a last word from you?
So I think it's really important that we remember that we have a role to play in supporting people in our communities, and that role really has to start with listening. So I think I would just like to leave with that in reminding us, as the most public of public institutions, we have a responsibility to really be listening to our communities and finding ways to support their needs.
And Roosevelt?
I truly believe that libraries are one of the several pillars of democracy. That democracy is being attacked. We have to stand together to make sure that we can stand not only for the people that we serve in our communities, but for democracy as a whole in this country.
These are all beautiful sentiments from three beautiful library leaders. And I was thrilled to spend this time with you. We could have spent so much more time because there is so much to talk about, and we're just scratching the surface on this. But thank you so very much for joining us today and for the great work you're doing on behalf of America's libraries.